Hello, grandson. This is your grandfather, and I'm going to tell you Jack Tale number 3. Now, the last time we left Jack, he had killed one giant, and then the next day he had killed 2 more giants, and he collected a lot of giant heads to take back to the king to get money. And the king said, "You're the best giant killer I've ever seen. Come on, stay the night, and you can take care of the other giants, and you can chop down all the trees on my new land." And Jack, he didn't want to do all that work because, remember, Jack was a lazy fella. But he also wanted to make some more money because you never know when you need more money. And besides, the king was going to fix him a big supper and breakfast the next morning. So he spent the night at the king's house and woke up the next day, ate a big breakfast, and went out to chop the trees down on the new ground. And he was not really excited about that because Jack, remember, was a lazy fella. So he took his little hatchet, went over into the woods, and thought, how am I going to get out of this work? Started chopping down one tree, and he was making a racket, a big old noise. And so along over the mountain came the old 4-headed giant. And in fact, I got a picture of him right here. My goodness, look at that 4-headed giant. Well, the 4-headed giant came up over the hill, and he saw his boys there lying dead as doornails and without their heads. And he saw Jack standing there and said, "Young man, what's your name?" And Jack said, "My name's Jack, Mr. Jack." And the giant with 4 heads said, "Well, Mr. Jack, what in the world happened to my boys?" And Jack said, "Well, I'll tell you what happened to them. I killed them, every one of them. I'm going to kill you too." And the 4-headed giant said, "Please don't kill me too. I've got a wife at home, another giant woman, and there's nobody to take care of her if I'm not around. So please don't kill me." And I tell you what I'll do. Mr. Jack, I'd like to take you home for lunch. Now, most people say, "I want to take you home for lunch." That means they're going to fix you lunch. But in the giant world, it meant they were going to eat you for lunch. And Jack knew exactly what that meant. But Jack decided he'd play along. And Jack said, "Okay, you take me home for lunch." And but Jack figured he needed to put the fear of Jack into that giant. So along the way, Jack asked this 4-headed giant, "Giant, why do you have these little tiny buckets in your hand?" And they weren't tiny buckets, they were big buckets. And the giant said, "Why, these are big buckets, and I'm gonna stop at this river over here and pull some water up for my wife so she can boil some water and fix us some lunch." Jack said, "Let me down off your shoulder." And the king took Jack off his shoulder, put him on the ground, and said, "Why did you want off my shoulder?" And Jack said, "It's silly to haul all that water in those tiny little buckets all the way to your house." And Jack got in the middle of the river, and he put his hands down in the river and started, "Okay, it's about to give, it's about to give, it's beginning to move." And the giant said, "Jack, what are you doing?" And Jack said, "I'm going to pick up the river and move it closer to your house." And the giant said, "Oh, please, don't do that, Jack. Leave that river alone. If you move it all the way to my house, when the rain comes, the river floods and it'll flood my house. You leave that river alone." And Jack said, "Okay." And Jack was picked up by the giant. The giant put him on his shoulder. The giant picked up some water into the buckets, and hurried on to his way to his house. When he got to his house, he told his wife what Jack had tried to do to the river. And the giant said to his wife, "We got to be careful around this Jack. He's a strong fella. He killed our boys." And the woman said to the giant, "Don't you worry none, because I know what I'll do. I'll pretend like I'm fixing us some lunch, boiling up some potatoes, and I'll have Jack sit on the shelf above the stove. And then at just the right time, I'll knock him into the pot, close the lid, and boil him up, and we'll eat him for lunch, and that'll be the end of Jack the Giant Killer." So the woman said to Jack, "Jack, why don't you sit up here on this shelf above the stove while I fix us some supper, or some lunch. I'm going to boil some potatoes." And Jack got up on that shelf, and he was moving around and couldn't get comfortable. And the giant lady said, "Why don't you sit still?" And Jack said, "I don't know how to sit on a shelf like this. I don't know how it's done. Can you show me?" And the woman said, "It's easy. You just sit down." And Jack said, I need someone to show me how to sit on this shelf." And so the giant woman got up on that shelf, and as soon as she did and said, "See, Jack, this is the way it's done," Jack took out his little hatchet and chopped the support out from under that shelf. The shelf fell down, the giant woman fell down, fell right into the pot of the boiling water, and Jack closed the lid and covered it up. And a few minutes later, the giant man, the four-headed man, came back into the kitchen and said, "Jack, where is my wife?" And Jack said, "I'm cooking her up for supper." And the four-headed giant lifted the lid of the pot and said, "Oh my goodness, there's my wife, dead as a doornail." And Jack said, "I'm going to have to do the same to you if you don't watch out." And the big giant said, "Jack, I tell you what to do. If you leave me alone, I will leave this land and never come back." And the last thing Jack ever saw of that giant was when that giant was walking over the mountain, and he disappeared. And we don't know where he went. We think he went to China, but we're not sure. Jack went back to the king and told him what he'd done. And he had taken the head off of the giant woman. And the king paid him even more money. But he said, "Jack, I can't pay you for the four-headed giant man, because he left somewhere and he may come back someday, so I can't pay you that." And Jack said, "Well, I understand. Fair is fair." And so the king said, "Tomorrow morning you can chop up the trees and you won't be bothered by any giants. It'll be easy work." Well, Jack, you know, he was a lazy fella, and he didn't think it was going to be so easy. And he decided he was going to go home. He had enough money. His pockets were full of money. So he went back to his mama and his daddy and his brothers Will and Tom. And that's the end of Jack the Giant Killer.